I'm going to pull up Clemson's schedule here. I have it already shared on my screen, and we're just going to go game by game, and we're going to talk about each matchup. Not going to spend the same amount of time on all of them as others for obvious reasons, but we're going to try to give as much of our thoughts on each individual game, and then then pick it. So here we go with Clemson's 2025 football schedule. Let me scroll up here. So of course, the opener, LSU. We've been talking about it ad nauseum all offseason. It's one of the most anticipated football games, not just on Clemson's schedule, but in all of college football. The battle for Death Valley, whatever you want to call it. Dabo Swinney versus Brian Kelly. Cade Klubnik versus Garrett Nussmeier. A lot of narratives heading into this football game. And there's a lot of stakes, I think, for both programs. I'm sure you agree that this is a very pivotal matchup, not really for either team's playoff hopes. I think either team could lose this game and still wind up in the playoff. But I think for narrative's sake, both programs have kind of been on the up and down over the last few seasons. Obviously, LSU has had a notorious streak of losses in opening week games. And Clemson hasn't been that much better when you look at it. I think both teams, with as much expectations as they have heading into the season, both teams want to get off to a hot start here. What do you see about this matchup that you think favors Clemson, and what do you see that you're still kind of waiting on seeing and kind of worried about heading into this football game?
Yeah, absolutely, Jordan. As you mentioned, the storylines for Clemson LSU week 1 night game in the Valley are endless, right? You got the whole Death Valley versus Death Valley. You got Brian Kelly out here calling it Death Valley Jr. and riling up the Clemson fans. You got LSU putting Clemson player faces on their tackling dummies. They got tiger paws everywhere. They got 1-0 in the facility. They've clearly made a concerted effort that week 1 is massively important. And it makes sense because Brian Kelly has yet to win a season opener since he's been the LSU head coach. So he's got a lot of pressure to do that. And we could, talk about and go into all the, fan storylines and stadium name storylines and all that kind of stuff. But really, all that matters is what happens on the field come August 30th in Death Valley. And as we know, this is not a breaking news answer, but this game is going to be decided in the trenches. And that's where I think Clemson's got a bit of an edge when you're talking about LSU's offensive line versus Clemson's defensive line. Everybody knows the names of Clemson's defensive linemen. A lot of them are projected as high NFL draft picks this coming NFL draft, and Peter Woods and TJ Parker. You also got DeMonte Capehart. You also got Will Help transfer from Purdue, right? On the flip side, LSU just lost a ton of guys to the NFL along the offensive line. They're essentially replacing basically their entire offensive line. And although they have some talented guys that are supposed to be stepping in, as we know, that's one of those positions where continuity is of the utmost importance. And I think when you're looking at it objectively, regardless of which fan base you're from, that is a check mark in the box of Clemson. Our defensive line versus their offensive line. And if our defensive line can put pressure and put Garrett Nussmeier in a box and rush him and make him feel like he has to do more, that's when the turnovers will come. Remember, as hyped up as Garrett Nussmeier is, and he's a great quarterback, he had 12 interceptions last season, right? So if you put him under pressure and he feels like he has to produce and they can't efficiently run the ball against Clemson's defense, again, that's another thing that we have to find out about the Clemson defense. How much better are we against the run? Because we were abysmal last year. We were absolutely abysmal. But LSU wasn't very good at running the ball last year either, even with those NFL offensive linemen that I mentioned that are now in the league. So who's going to win out there? It's obviously going to be a trenches game. But when you're talking about Clemson's defensive line versus LSU's offensive line, I think you got to give the nod to Clemson on that particular matchup.
Yeah, 100%. And you mentioned with LSU's offensive line. I mean, like, do we think like they have a new starter at center? It's pretty clear Braylon Moore at this point, the transfer from Virginia Tech, he's going to be the guy that steps in. On the interior, they have some. I think they have some talented pieces, but it's a lot of youth. I think they really don't know what they have in tackle right now. I think they have an idea of who's going to start, but they don't really. The confidence doesn't seem to be there. I don't think. And so, my question is okay. So you feel good about TJ Parker getting it, stepping in and producing. Obviously we got to see it from Will Help. As he's been everything that they've hoped to be in the off season and spring and fall camp. He's always shown up. They feel really, really confident that he's going to be a very productive player for him. But at the end of the day, he hasn't done it in a Clemson uniform.
Yep.
So that's a question. I think a small question, but it's a question nonetheless. And as much as they've touted the depth that they've developed at defensive end, that's something we still got to see. They've raved about Jaheim Lawson. Well, he's got to go out and do it. He's done all the preparation. He's done everything that he needs to do. But at the end of the day, you still got to go play. And so, when you talk about how confident you feel about this matchup, you still have to answer a couple of those minor questions. So that's one thing I'm going to be watching. Like how well is Clemson winning up front? Because I do think they'll win up front. I'm just are they going to be dominant, or are they going to lose some reps that you're just kind of like, oh, okay, I'm not really sure how much we've improved this year. So that's one of the things. And you talked about the run defense. You got to be better, especially on the edge. Bumping Peter Woods back inside, I think it's a big deal. Getting Will Helt, of course, and getting your younger defensive ends stronger has been a big deal, and that's been a focal point for this offseason. But you still got to do it. And LSU, they know they sucked at running the football last year. They were, I believe they were in the 90s, I think, in rush attempts last year. Like they gave up on running the football a lot of times. And they have some talented backs. Caden Durham, Harlem Berry is a guy they are extremely high on, and a guy to watch. Like they have some really, really good backs, but they just, even with the NFL offensive line, like you mentioned, they weren't able to get it done. So, will they be able to, with whatever adjustments they've made schematically, will Clemson be able to counter that? So it's going to be a chess game in a lot of ways, and neither of these teams are as touted as Clemson is. I mean they're not a complete product. They shouldn't be considered a complete product considering how they ended last season, and they don't deserve that benefit of the doubt. So you got to go prove it. But at the end of the day, I think it's going to come down to the trenches. I still like where Clemson is relative to LSU. And in that respect, and of course just the continuity that they have on both sides of the ball, and I think that's going to be enough. I think LSU is going to be a really good football team down the stretch. I do think they have some really talented players. And I guess one other thing I do kind of think about is the one thing I think Clemson did last year was teams that had lateral speed. Guys that could stretch the defense sideline to sideline. LSU certainly has some playmakers that can stretch the defense sideline to sideline. That receiving room, they have a lot of guys that can run. Not a lot of size necessarily, but they've got guys that can run. I mean, Chris Hilton Jr. Is a guy is probably going to be one of the fastest players in college football. Barry Brown, of course, the transfer from Kentucky. They have some, and obviously they bring in Nick Anderson from Oklahoma. They have Aaron Anderson returning. They've got a lot of these guys can run. So I think the biggest thing is how much does Clemson, how much can they? I feel like LSU is going to try to quit game and screens and maybe try to do some things to just get the ball outside of their playmakers. How well does Clemson adjust to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you bring up a lot of good points there, and that really is going to be the cat and mouse game of who's made the most improvements, because when you look at these two teams, both of their weaknesses kind of line up with each other, right? LSU did not run the ball well last year. Clemson didn't stop the run last year very well, and we that's well documented. And then when you flip the script, um, LSU's defense gave up a ton of explosive runs last year. That was one of their major problems. So how much improved are they on the defensive side of the ball? Obviously, they went to the transfer portal and they plugged holes that they felt like that they had. But how do those guys mesh together? Are they a much improved defense in 2025 versus the version of what they were in 2024, which was not very good, right? But on the flip side, towards the end of the season, Clemson's running game kind of fell apart because of the injury from Phil Maffa. So it's kind of interesting when you look at these two teams. There's a lot of similarities when you're looking at them, and it's going to be a heck of a game. I think it's going to be the best game on week one, and that's saying a lot because you got Ohio State, Texas facing off earlier in the day at noon, big noon kickoff over there in the shoe. But I think Clemson LSU is going to be a very back and forth game. I do not see either team really pulling away or a blowout in any sense of the word. I think these two teams are very good. I think their hype for both teams are deserved, and it's going to play out to be a fourth quarter football game.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think we didn't really spend too much time on the offense just because we feel so strongly about just where they are. But you mentioned LSU's defense, and they've retooled their defensive line. I think they certainly are much improved in that respect. Obviously you'll take having the experienced offensive line in this matchup, even if you're going against a talented defensive line. And how did they look on the second level? I mean, I think they have some capable pieces. Whit Weeks is a guy that he's a very good football player, a guy that's going to be all over the field. He's going to be flying to the football. But they have a lot of new pieces on the back end. How does a highly touted recruit Harold Perkins look at the star position? They certainly still have a lot of questions to answer, and I think you have to feel good even breaking in a new running back with Clemson that you're going to be able to move the ball and get some and score in this football game. So all of that being said, this is going to be a really, really good football game. I'm super excited. Can't wait to be there. It's going to be one of the best matchups I think of the entire season, because I do think these two teams will be in playoff contention towards the end of the year. So gotta love what this means for college football in a time where college football playoff implications are everything, and the rules and the seeding, and that's all anybody cares about now. Like, I still want people to appreciate what this matchup is and what it means, because you don't get too many of those in a season. And with, like I said, with the changes and kind of the attitude towards the regular season, with the advent of the playoff and the expansion, like, these types of games have kind of lost, I think, some of their magic, and I don't want to see that go. And so I implore everybody to just enjoy this game for what it is, regardless of the result. Even if Clemson loses, I think this is great for college football. It's great for both programs, and I'm super excited to watch it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something important that you mentioned there, Jordan, is giving both LSU and Clemson credit for scheduling like this, especially for a week one game, right? And it being a home and home series. And, Clemson's done this in the past, with Georgia as well. It wasn't a technical home and home, but, venues that were closer to each other's school and whatnot. And LSU, we talk about Brian Kelly and how he has not, won an opener since he's been the head coach at LSU. Well, that's because LSU is scheduled very aggressively. So shout out to them. Shout out to Clemson. And yeah, unfortunately, one of these really good teams is going to have to go away with a loss in week one. But as you mentioned at the top, that's not going to be, it's not like your season's over if you lose this game, whether you're LSU or whether you're Clemson. Everything is still in front of you. It's a non conference game. As long as you don't go in and, get your doors blown off, um, it's not going to be that detrimental to your season.
Yeah, 100%. I just definitely want to win it. Definitely think Clemson they need to treat this like a must win. Obviously, this is you gotta have perspective, regardless of the result. So that's another thing. It will be a very very disappointing thing to look on if Clemson does not win this football game. Not because I don't think LSU is capable of winning this game. Obviously, I think both teams. I think LSU fans would feel the same way if they, if they're on the losing end of this. They're going to feel like this was a missed opportunity to kind of change the narrative. I think because both teams have a lot to prove in this season. So, with that being said, I think that's something that we really need to keep in mind and keep in perspective.